In 2007, road construction workers in Yanqing County broke ground on a new road and hit bones, hundreds of skeletons, stacked in layers, directly beneath a section of the Great Wall. No tombs, no markers, no names. The people who built the wall had been buried under it. Historians estimate between 400,000 and 1 million people died building the various walls. Conscripted farmers, convicts, and political prisoners. They left no written records. Their deaths were administrative facts, logged in provincial ledgers, most of which were later lost, burned, or never preserved. The laborers who built the Ming Wall had no legal right to refuse service, and no guarantee their families would be told they were gone. Some weren't given that much. When bodies couldn't be removed for burial, they went into the foundations, into the fill, into the rammed earth that was the wall's core. The wall ate the people who built it. Some of them are still in there, right now, under the stones where tourists stand. That's the part that doesn't appear in the tourist brochures, and it didn't get there by accident. No law banned the truth. No edict silenced it. Something quieter did. Today, there's a fat gift shop at the gate. The bones still don't have people who plaque. The erasure started before the mortar dried, and it started at the top. Go back to 221 BCE, because that's where this actually begins. A man named Qin Shi Huang, 38 years old at the time, who is always worth pausing on. The idea of someone remaking an entire civilization before 40 unified China for the first time in its history and immediately launched 2 enormous projects simultaneously. Most history textbooks treat them as completely separate things. They aren't. First project, the Wall. Connecting and extending defensive barriers along the northern frontier, conscripting around 800,000 people to do it. The largest forced labor mobilization in the ancient world. Second project, the burning of the books. In 213 BCE, his chancellor Li Si, and I want to stay on Li Si for a moment because he has a habit of disappearing into the background when people tell this story. But he was the actual architect of this policy. The person who designed and sold it to the emperor stood before the court and proposed that all texts not serving the Qin dynasty be destroyed. Histories of rival kingdoms. Philosophical traditions questioning imperial authority. Any written record that lets people imagine China differently from what the emperor had made it. Scholars holding these texts had 30 days to surrender them. After that, possession was a crime. The penalty was 4 years of hard labor on the northern wall. Those caught teaching the texts from memory faced execution. Sima Qian, writing roughly a century later, records 460 scholars killed and buried alive, though the exact details are disputed. The rest went to the wall, which, on the timelines involved, was a death sentence of a slower kind. What strikes me about those 2 projects running together, the wall and the book burning, same emperor, same decade, one logic, is that they're not really 2 things at all. You conscript 800,000 bodies to build a monument and simultaneously destroy the framework those bodies would have used to describe what's happening to them. Build the stone, burn the frame. Wait long enough for the stone to become the only story left. The decree didn't specifically target the wall's dead. It didn't need to. Any account that portrayed state labor projects as catastrophic was, by definition, a threat. The silence around the bodies was structural before anyone decided to enforce it. To understand what was actually silenced, you need to know what the labor force looked like. This is where the scale of it becomes genuinely hard to sit with. The workforce came from 3 places. Soldiers first, around 300,000, commanded by a general named Meng Tian who'd spent years fighting the Xiongnu on the northern steppe and was now told to simultaneously garrison that frontier and build a wall across it for 9 years. Then conscripted civilians, farmers pulled from fields when the army's numbers weren't enough. Estimates run to around 500,000, something close to 20% of China's entire population at the time. Whole villages lost all their working men at once. Women farmed alone. Sons grew up without fathers because their fathers were on the wall or buried in the ground under it. And then criminals and political prisoners, scholars who'd missed the book surrender deadline, men given sentences of 4 or 10 years with an implicit understanding built into the system that they wouldn't survive them. Mountain terrain in the far north. Supply chains are breaking down routinely, sometimes for months. A construction schedule driven by what the emperor needed rather than what humans could survive, and those are 2 very different quantities. The distance between them is what the death toll is. The summer heat that killed men was already ground down from the previous winter. Winter cold that stripped the flesh from men who'd barely recovered from the summer. No mechanism for removing dead bodies from the worksite. site, no infrastructure for treating injury. Any man who could no longer work either continued anyway or died where he stood. Those were the two options, and the system had been designed to offer no others. A system with no exit except death runs itself. The wall kept growing. The workforce kept dying. More men were conscripted to replace the dead. Those men walked into the same conditions. Nobody in the capital was tracking the ratio of walls built to workers lost. Nobody was supposed to. The wall kept growing, but structured silence never holds perfectly. Folk memory found the gaps. And what happened next is the part that should unsettle you most, because the Empire didn't just suppress the story, it absorbed it. There's a detail that shows you the exact shape of what Lisi's decree could and couldn't reach, and it matters because it tells you precisely how targeted the suppression was. The decree was aimed precisely at texts questioning imperial authority, but it was completely blind to everything adjacent to its target. Women's grief fell outside its scope. Fired clay fell outside its scope. Stories that travel mouth to ear and never exist as physical objects that can be confiscated and burned. Those too. Workers on the wall scratched out messages on clay tablets and ostraca. Fired fragments left at work sites, found by archaeologists 2,000 years later, not because anyone preserved them, but because fired clay doesn't decompose the way paper does. The system could burn papyrus and silk and bamboo, clay it couldn't touch. The Soldier's Ballad, written around 200 CE, uses the wall as shorthand for imperial cruelty in language so plain it needs no interpretation. It survived because poetry in classical Chinese moves through channels that administrative control can't fully close. That is the story the stone tells. Here is what the stone does not say. That pattern, what outlasts the erasure and why, maps the exact shape of what was attempted. If the erasure had been accidental, just the natural decay of time, everything would be gone, or everything would survive. What's left instead is specifically the things that were hardest to control. Grief, clay, the spoken word. That's not decay, that's a fingerprint. The suppression was precise in its target and completely blind to everything outside it. You can read the shape of it from the shape of what remains. The legend of Meng Jiangnu survived for 2,000 years without official protection because it didn't need any. Her husband, Fan Zhiliang in most versions, though the name shifts across retellings, was taken for wall construction shortly after they married. She waited for word. None came. When winter arrived and she still hadn't heard anything, she sewed warm clothes and walked north to find him, because what else do you do when someone is taken and there's no word? At the wall she was told he'd died, worked to death. His body was in the foundation. Meng Jiangnu wept, and in the version told and retold for 2,000 years, her grief was so concentrated and true and impossible to contain that the wall itself broke open under the weight of it. A section collapsed. Her husband's bones fell out. That story spread village to village, generation to generation, because it named something official history had sealed over. The wall cost something, and the people who paid weren't the ones who ordered it built. It became one of China's 4 great folk tales, same tier as the white snake and the butterfly lovers, among the most widely circulated stories in Chinese popular culture for 2 millennia. It persisted because it was doing work that nothing official could do, carrying in the language of grief what history could no longer say. The wall took our men. Their bones are inside it. We won't forget, even if all we have left is a story about a woman who wept hard enough to bring the stones down. Emperors heard the story. Several had the temple dedicated to Meng Jiangnu reclassified, not destroyed, reclassified. She became a loyal wife, a monument to virtue rather than protest. They didn't erase her, they absorbed her, and the absorption was more complete than any erasure could have been. Because erasure you can fight. You can find the decree, the censor, the moment of decision, and point at it. What happened to Meng Jiangnu is what a sophisticated institutional system does when it has learned that silencing a counter-narrative only makes it louder. You don't burn the story, you build it a temple. You let the grief be honored in a location you control. With an entrance fee and a gift shop, the story survives. The argument inside it doesn't. She became a symbol of loyalty rather than a symbol of what the wall cost. The temple is still there. The bones still don't have a plaque. The grief got a monument. The injustice that produced the grief got a caption about virtue. That is a more sophisticated operation than burning. It leaves no decree to find, no censor to name, no moment of decision to point at. The system simply reclassified what the grief was about, and the reclassification worked well enough that most people who visit the temple today do not know they are standing at the site of a 2,000-year protest that was successfully neutralized by being given a roof and an official designation. What came next is the part that reveals the whole mechanism, because the wall she was mourning had already failed, completely. The mythology consistently skips this. The wall didn't work. As a military barrier, the thing it was supposedly built to be, it was essentially a failure, not a revisionist reading. Chinese scholars said this openly for centuries. The wall Genghis Khan encountered was a patchwork, sections of rammed earth dissolved by rain, brick fortifications never properly connected, stretches of territory so remote they were left essentially unwalled. He didn't breach it. He went around it, through the gaps, or past Ramen soldiers who were chronically underfunded, stationed at the worst posting in the Chinese military, and often open to arrangements that didn't involve dying for a wall the capital had long since stopped maintaining. The wall was long. It was never finished. The gap was always somewhere. Chinese emperors poured fortunes into reinforcing one section and found the frontier still porous somewhere else. The scholars who studied this weren't writing politely. They called the wall a monument to fear, a policy that consumed the people and failed its purpose, proof that their ancestors couldn't solve a political problem by any means, other than forcing the poor to build stone in mountains until they died. One described it as evidence of a crippling national insecurity. Another called it a bankrupting policy. That was the honest assessment, and it held for 300 years. The proof that finally settled the question, the definitive evidence that the wall couldn't do the one thing it was built to do, came from inside. In 1644, the Ming dynasty was collapsing from within. The peasant revolt was spreading from the interior, and political decay was so advanced that the state had essentially stopped functioning. At Shanhai Pass, the critical gate where the wall meets the sea in the northeast, a Ming general named Wu Sangui held his position with Manchu forces outside and rebel forces closing from the south. Wu Sangui opened the gate. He let the Manchu walk through. A wall that had consumed perhaps 1 million lives didn't fall to military genius or siege machinery. It fell because the man holding the keys looked at his options and decided opening the door was more rational than dying behind it. Build a defensive system on coerced labor, staff it with soldiers treated as expendable for 2 centuries, then ask it to hold under existential pressure. Coerced loyalty has a time limit, and 1644 was it. That's when it gets genuinely strange, because the people who walked through Wu Sangui's open gate didn't tear the wall down. They turned it into a national icon. The Qing rulers were Manchu, the people the wall had been built to keep out. Once in power, they commissioned paintings, poetry, and imperial inspection tours that celebrated the wall as proof of Chinese civilization's depth and longevity. They didn't need it as a fortification. Their territory extended hundreds of miles beyond it. They needed it as evidence that the empire they now governed had always been extraordinary, that they were its rightful inheritors, that the story of China was one of continuous greatness. Think about what that required. 3 centuries of Chinese intellectual consensus called the wall a catastrophic mistake. Scholars had said so in print, repeatedly, with specifics. The Qing erasure of that consensus wasn't achieved by decree. It was achieved simply by producing a different image with more resources and greater repetition until it became the dominant one. The laborers buried in Yanqing don't appear in those paintings. Neither do their names. The wall had completed its transformation from infrastructure into symbol, and symbols get to choose what they remember. And the next people to pick it up didn't even have to build anything. They just needed to rebrand what was already there. Then, in 1912, the last emperor was removed, and somebody needed the wall to mean something even larger. A new nationalist government inherited a fractured country with hundreds of competing regional identities and no unifying story, no image that could hold all of those different peoples under the same flag. It needed a symbol, something that said in the language of stone, "We were always one people, always capable of greatness." Here is the proof standing right there on the northern mountains. The wall was available, large, dramatic, old-looking, already there, needing only a new caption rather than a new construction project. Sun Yat-sen called it a mighty creation that had preserved the Chinese race, which would have surprised the scholars who'd spent the previous 3 centuries calling it a catastrophic mistake. But that was, in a way, the point. The honest assessment was a liability. The myth was an asset. A new nation needs assets more urgently than it needs accurate assessments of its own worst decisions. Mao Zedong sharpened this in 1935 during the Long March, a gifted poet, whatever else you want to say about him, writing a poem whose closing line became one of the most repeated phrases in 20th century China. "If you have not climbed the Great Wall, you are not a real person." Think about what that sentence does. The monument of coerced labor, of bones in the foundations, of a gate opened from the inside. In one line of verse, it becomes the measure of authentic Chinese identity. No room in that frame for Meng Jiangnu. No room for the scholars who called it a mistake. All of it compressed into a single instruction: look at this and feel proud. What happened next should have ended it. It almost did. In 1966, Mao launched the Cultural Revolution, targeting what he called the Four Olds. Old ideas, old culture, old customs, old habits. Temples demolished, monuments smashed. The Great Wall, an ancient symbol of imperial power, should have been a natural target. In some stretches it was. Local people dismantled wall sections brick by brick to build houses, pigsties, and reservoir walls. The government said nothing. Not because it was approved, but because by then the wall had become too politically tangled to defend as heritage, while simultaneously dismantling the imperial past it was supposed to represent. Local officials looked away. The bricks disappeared into farmhouses. Hundreds of kilometers of Ming fortifications came apart. Those peasants were, in a strange way, completing something their ancestors had started. Ancestors built the wall under compulsion. They were reclaiming the materials. The detail that matters. Nobody wrote a memo ordering the dismantling. Nobody wrote a memo ordering the looking away. The same institutional logic that had produced the forgetting was now producing something that looked like its opposite, and it was doing it by the same mechanism. No directive. Just a system reading its own logic and acting accordingly. Nobody wrote a memo ordering the forgetting. Nobody needed to. The reversal that followed was just as silent and far more complete. In 1984, Deng Xiaoping launched the Love the Great Wall campaign. Crumbling sections were restored, entrance fees were set. In 1987, UNESCO added it to the World Heritage List. The section at Badaling, the one most foreign tourists visit, is approximately 95% reconstruction, concrete cores faced with new brick shaped to look ancient. Stand at Badaling today, you are standing above the bones, not metaphorically. Archaeological surveys have confirmed humans with new mains in sections of the original Qin-era earthworks beneath the restored surface. The people whose remains are buried have no name on any wall you can see from where you are standing. They have no plaque. They have no audio guide entry. The audio guide you can rent at the entrance covers the Ming Dynasty construction timeline, the architectural specifications of the watchtowers, and the story of how the wall was rediscovered by the world in the 20th century. It does not cover the 2007 Yanqing discovery. It does not cover the conscription system. It does not cover what the workforce was paid, or whether they were paid at all, or what happened to the ones who couldn't keep working. It does not cover Meng Jiangnu, or what her temple was originally protesting, or why the protest was reclassified as a virtue story. The tourists standing above those bones feel something that has been carefully engineered for them to feel pride, wonder, the weight of civilization reaching back through stone into their hands. Those feelings are real. They're just not the complete picture of what's available to feel in that place if you actually know what you're standing on. That is the system, not the wall, the system. The same institutional logic that created no administrative category for worker who died building this in 200 BCE is the logic that determines what the Badaling audio guide covers in 2024. Nobody coordinated it. Nobody wrote a memo. The system simply has no category for the thing you're trying to name, so the thing has no name, and the tourists walk past it every day, feeling exactly what they were designed to feel, standing on top of exactly what they were designed not to know. The Meng Jiangnu story is where the mechanism becomes visible. What happened to that story is the mechanism itself made visible. The story held for 2,000 years across every dynasty. It is still one of China's 4 great folk tales today, and there is now a dedicated memorial area for Meng Jiangnu at the eastern end of the wall near Shanhai Pass. A temple, official plaques, a tourist stop is built into the itinerary. A story that spent 2 millennia keeping the true cost of the wall alive in popular memory after everything that could have been written was burned, has been folded into the wall's own tourist infrastructure. The monument absorbed the grief that was protesting it. The most powerful proof of what the wall cost is now a feature of visiting the wall. The grief got a temple. The bones still don't have a plaque. This is what I think is more unsettling than deliberate suppression would be, because deliberate suppression you can fight. You can find the decree, the censor, the moment of decision, and point at it. What happened to the Meng Jiangnu story is what an institutional system does when it's sophisticated enough to absorb its counter-narratives rather than silence them. You don't burn the story. You build it a temple. You let the grief be honored in a location you control, with an entrance fee and a gift shop. The grief and the acknowledgement are both real. The cost of the grief is pointed at, but goes completely unmentioned. No law kept those bones unnamed. No single authority coordinated the erasure across 2,000 years. Qin Shi Huang, the Qing emperors, the nationalist government under Sun Yat-sen, Mao's revolutionary committees, and Deng's tourism ministry didn't share a memo. They shared something older than a memo, an institutional logic that knows which stories make a civilization look capable and which ones make it look cruel, and quietly roots around the second kind. That's the logic Meng Jiangnu's temple governors understood when they reclassified her as a loyal wife. It's the logic the Qing painters applied when they left the labor force out of the frame. It's the logic that determines what the battling audio guide covers and what it doesn't. It's the logic that the recording infrastructure was running in 213 BCE, when there was no administrative category for worker who died building this that was separate from fill material. No slot in the ledger, so no name in the ledger. The wall ate the men who built it. The record-keeping ate their names. Not from malice, but from institutional logic that was never built to care about the difference. That distinction matters more than it might seem, because a decision you can expose. You can name the person, find the document, and demonstrate the intent. A logic that runs without a decision is harder to fight, because there's no one to accuse and nothing to overturn. The system simply has no category for the thing you're trying to name. The tourists standing above those bones feel something that has been carefully engineered for them to feel. Pride, wonder, the weight of civilization reaching back through stoshing into their hands. Those feelings are real. They're just not the complete picture of what's available to feel in that place, if you actually know what you're standing on. And most people never find out, because the system that made the bones unnameable in 200 BCE is the same system that keeps them unmentioned on the plaques today. It didn't need to be maintained. It just needed no reason to change. The Yanqing skeletons made local news in 2007. Then they went quiet. The wall is still there. It still tells a story. It just doesn't tell theirs. We inherited a world built by systems running this exact logic. No archivist of forgetting, no ministry of erasure, no named administrator choosing which names to keep. Qin Shi Huang and a 20th century nationalist and a communist reformer all reached independently for the same wall because it was available, and the mechanism that made it work, separating the monument from what the monument cost, needed no instruction manual and required no conspiracy. You don't have to teach an institution to forget the people it consumed, you just have to give it no reason to remember them. The system had no slot for him, so he has no name. The next video takes you into a different civilization running this same system. Different monument, same logic, different names nobody put on the plaques, and what the people inside it eventually did about it, the slow ways they found to push back against a machine with no one visibly at the controls. That's the part buried deepest, and the part that matters most. Subscribe. You don't want to miss where this goes.